Chapter 1261, Flames of Talent. According to Caliburn, the Oscorps also had machinations in building the bridge through the chasm. In fact, every company in the world seemed truly interested in being the first one to build it. After all, if they built the bridge, they could control the flow of commerce through it. Everyone would have to pay at least something in order to pass, and that was an opportunity too good to pass up despite the inherent risks in building the bridge. Trilla was the one tasked by the Oscorps to build the bridge. And since the Lionhearts were now allies with Reborn, they would also be allied to Trilla in extension. Of course, Michael also had plans of building the bridge himself. He had the designs, he had the raw materials, now he just needed the permission. Unlike most, he wasn't planning on using brute force to build the bridge. He would rather create a good relationship with the demi-humans in the chasm rather than defeat them. And when he told this to Caliburn, the Lionheart Patriarch immediately raised his concerns. "Are you sure, Michael? These demi-humans are different from the ones you're used to. They don't seem civilized. Anytime that humans tried to make contact with them, they always attacked first despite the obvious white flag being raised." He was right. The Shadow Orcs already tried to send messengers to the demi-humans, but it seemed that even their fellow species weren't allowed inside their underground civilization. But that didn't mean they were uncivilized. These demi-humans retreated to the underground for a reason. They probably were tired of the life they had overground, where they were treated less like a human and more like an animal. So they're afraid that they would be treated the same by the humans. "I'm sure about this," he said to Caliburn. "Tell Trilla to delay her plans of attacking the chasm." Caliburn doubted his words but nodded eventually. "But how are you going to talk with them? They'll attack any messenger that you send." "Through a demi-human, I want to show them that we treat their kind without any discrimination at all," Michael replied. Caliburn saw it for himself, so he didn't doubt it. "However, you'll still need to rebuff their attacks. Once you show up to the chasm, they'll attack you at once even if you show them you mean no harm. You'll have to defeat them first, then force them to listen." As expected of a general, Caliburn had a good intuition about this. "Once Trilla comes here, we will send a group to communicate with the demi-humans," Caliburn added. "With my swordsmen, those demi-humans won't be able to defeat us so easily." This was a good idea, in theory, but Michael knew that showing up with an entire army or battalion would only end up angering the demi-humans, forcing both sides to spill blood before any conversation was started between them. Michael had to come at them using peaceful methods. He was going to send yellow mankeys and demi-humans. That's the only way to show Reborn's true ideals to them. And how are they going to protect themselves? Michael coughed. "Jakku." After some convincing, Jakku finally joined the Lionheart boot camp along with the recruits. He was the only one who could go over to the chasm and ensure the safety of their messengers without provoking any large reactions from the demi-humans. For once, his lazy demeanor would be a boon rather than a curse. Once they saw Jakku lazing around, not doing anything, they wouldn't feel threatened by him and therefore wouldn't attack so hastily. This would give the messengers more time to try and convince the underground demi-human civilization to open up to Reborn. Still, it would be good for Jakku to be prepared. He may be extremely talented, but he was mostly untrained. When Jakku appeared in front of Caliburn and the other Lionheart instructors, they were immediately put off by his lackadaisical attitude. This was the swordsman that bested their most talented youngster. This was the demi-human who manifested the ancient roar. Still underwhelmed by Jakku, the Lionhearts requested for him to show off some of his moves. Jakku frowned, not wanting to be bothered doing that, but eventually he relented. Blue lightning erupted from his skin, sizzling through him and to his sword. Each swing of his sword was lightning fast. Only its afterimage was seen, and after some delay one could even hear the crack of thunder as the beyond sonic speed blade hit the air. The Lionhearts were impressed. More than impressed, they were astounded by the power he was emanating. Judging from pure firepower and speed, they now saw why the heavenly swordmistress chose him instead of Arthur. While others were awed, Caliburn kept his expression calm. "Who taught you how to wield a sword?" Jaku shrugged, no one. What kind of style do you use? I don't know a fast one. Even before this, it was already widely obvious that Jaku hadn't had any formal training. His moves, although fast and powerful, were way too inefficient. It was only through his speed and power that he was able to overcome the weaknesses in his untrained style. This made Jaku that much more of a fearsome talent. He hadn't even had training and he was already this powerful. What more would he be once he learned the eternal flame style of the Lionhearts? Excited, Caliburn turned towards Jaku and showed him the first style, a defense-focused move that allowed him to defend. You must focus on your core, one of the instructors said. It's where your power will come from, and your posture, it must be straight but not rigid, or else you won't be able to gather any kind of strength. The recruits in the boot camp continued to practice their moves. Jaku stood to the side, having his own space to practice. Tell me once he finishes the first form, Caliburn said, then we will teach him. Before he could even finish his words, a bright blue flame erupted to the side. Caliburn turned towards Jaku, seeing a blue circle of fire around his body. Chapter 1262, Blue Flame. The Lionhearts were so surprised that they almost dropped their swords to the ground. Even Caliburn was at a loss for words. They couldn't believe it. Jaku had swung his sword in a circle around him, and suddenly blue fire erupted from the tip of his blade. His movements were perfect, the arc flawless. It was as if he had been one of the senior members of the Lionheart family performing the sword style. And this was only his first time trying it out. If they weren't seeing it for themselves, they wouldn't have believed it. Even the best and the most talented Lionhearts could only complete the first form after a month of practice. And yet, Jaku was able to do it in a single try. That wasn't even the most surprising part. It was the fact that his fire was blue. It was blue. The signature flame of the Lionhearts was a fiery red. It's the very reason why their emblem was a red flame. Of course, that didn't mean that there was no variations amongst them. As the Lionhearts became more proficient with their sword style, they were able to morph their flame into different forms that were suited to their own personalities. After all, each person had their own understanding of the eternal flame sword style. But usually, that would only happen after they had practiced the sword form for years and decades. It was a measure of a Lionheart swordsman's mastery of the sword style if they could change the flame into something other than the signature flame of their family. And yet, Jaku, who had not had any formal training until today, who had not seen the eternal flame sword style until just a few minutes ago, was able to complete the first form and create a blue flame. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was clear right there in their very own eyes. Jaku flourished his sword, creating a bit of movement in the perfect circle of blue flame that he created. Eventually, the flame subsided, ending the sword style. He wiped the sweat off his forehead. There, I did it right, can I take the day off? No one could say anything. Even Caliburn could do nothing as Jaku slowly walked off the practice area to once again rest back in his room. They had no rebuttal against him. After all, he had basically sped up weeks of training in just a few minutes. He shouldn't have been able to even summon fire in his swing until a few days later. So, in a way, Jaku was right. He was done. He didn't need to come to practice until a few weeks later. It was only after a few minutes later did everything finally come to a point for the Lionhearts. No way he was able to summon Blue Flame. How was he able to perform the first style so easily? It's even better than mine. I refuse to believe this is the first time he'd practiced it. He must have been doing it for months now. But despite their protests, they knew the truth. They just couldn't accept it. Meanwhile, Caliburn couldn't help but gaze at the fatting figure of Jaku in the distance. His eyes burned with excitement, with vigor. It was as if he was a man trapped in a desert and suddenly a sea of water just appeared right in front of him. Jaku's talent was too overwhelming. The fact that he was able to understand the essence of the eternal flame with just a single practice session meant that his talent was truly out of this world. It was better than anything he'd ever seen. And because of this, Caliburn was excited about the future. He wanted to teach this kid personally. He could only wonder what kind of beast he'd be once he completely learned the eternal flame sword style. Would they finally be able to perform the sixth style thought to have been lost in history? Somehow, Caliburn believed that Jakku could replicate it through his sheer talent. It was at this moment that Caliburn decided that he'd want Jakku as his personal student. It was a complete waste that this dragonborn had just been going about his life without a personal master. If he had been taught to wield a sword from a very young age, then he would probably be an unparalleled master right now. He'd be someone that could defeat even the heavenly swordmistress. Just the thought of it excited Caliburn. Right now, Jakku was an unpolished stone, but with a little bit of training he could be a priceless fiery ruby, one that would be an incredible testament to the power of the eternal flame sword style. So he immediately turned to the rest of the Lionhearts. From here on out, Jakku will be my personal student. I will be teaching him the hidden sword style of our family. The Lionhearts all went wide-eyed with his proclamation, but after a few seconds they could only accept it with grace. That overwhelming talent was simply too good to pass up. And so, after compiling the knowledge of the Lionhearts in a book, Caliburn went towards Michael's estate in order to inform him about his request. Meanwhile, a marching army trudged through the streets of the nation of Reborn with wide eyes. They bore the insignia of the Order of the Heavenly Knights. Behind them was an elderly woman, one that had a white cloth over her eyes. She was none other than Eldia, the heavenly swordmistress. And finally, she had arrived in Reborn. For what reason? She was here to search for her student, of course. Jakku refused her request for him to go into the Order's estate, so she instead came to him. She saw his talent and therefore wanted to be the master that molded him. So with great haste, she immediately went towards Michael's estate. She didn't even have time to appreciate the sparkling beauty of Reborn in the nighttime. And just as she was about to knock in their doors, her knock was echoed by another beside her. Chapter 1263, Eldia's Disturbance. She turned around and saw that one of the Rebornian attendants of the estate had knocked to take her attention. "Excuse me, who are you?" The other heavenly knight took offense to the demi-human's words, but Eldia did not take it to heart and simply raised her hands to stop her knights from drawing their swords needlessly. "My name is Eldia and I wish to talk with your leader, Michael. He is here, correct? I was searching for him in New Sparta but could not find him there." The Rebornian attendant, a centaur in charge of patrolling the gates, nodded. "I see. Yes, our supreme leader is here currently in the estate. Unfortunately, he is already meeting with someone at the very moment." Eldia's eyebrows raised at the mention of the words supreme leader, but did not mention it then. "I see. Would you be able to contact me as soon as he is available?" Eldia asked him. "Very well," said the centaur. "I can see that you're all travelers from another territory. If you would like, I can escort you to our guest house where you can stay while you wait for our supreme leader to be available." "That would be great, thank you." The centaur then trotted forwards, leading the group of knights towards another, much smaller gate on the western side of the estate. Here, beyond the gates, they just saw a collection of small houses arranged in a circle, more than enough to house her knights comfortably. These houses were small for Rebornians, but for most it was luxurious. The knights had to let go of their wariness as soon as they saw their lodging. King-sized beds, comfortable sofas and chairs, luxurious decorations all around. They were now starting to understand the appeal of the Reborn company. While her knights were winding down from their long travels, Eldia walked over to the open space backyard, containing a garden with a large tree at the very center. As she walked, she couldn't help but let her mind wander. And as she did, she finally stopped a few meters away from the tree and finally noticed that there was someone here, someone other than the knights. She stopped, frowning. Was it because she was distracted that she didn't sense this person's presence, or was it because of something else? Despite her blindness, Eldia was considered to be one of the most perceptive heavenly knights in the world. No one could sneak up to her without her knowing. Yet, as she became more and more aware of the person resting on the base of the tree, she began to realize that perhaps she wasn't as perceptive as she thought. This human man didn't look to be all that impressive. He wasn't trying to hide himself at all. He was just sleeping, peacefully, soundly, so much so that he completely blended himself to his surroundings. She couldn't help but think that perhaps this human man was more surprising than she initially thought. The power to immerse themselves into one's surroundings was a technique that could only be achieved through years and years of cumulative meditation. Whoever was in front of her must have been doing this for a long time. And as she walked closer, she did not conceal her own presence. Yet even as she, a foreign entity, entered into the human space, the man in question didn't even seem to notice or regard her. He continued to sleep as if nothing in the world mattered to him. Perhaps she could even attack him now and he wouldn't have even noticed it. Of course, she wouldn't, but as a warrior she had those thoughts as a self-defense mechanism. As she continued to walk closer and closer, there was something inside her that was beginning to awaken. A thought. A familiar thought. It's as if she'd seen this presence before. No, she was sure she had met this person before. But she couldn't understand it. So despite being in a foreign land, she used her enhanced perception to look at the man. Suddenly, a new world opened up to her, one that was filled with lines that curved and morphed to indicate a presence that disturbed the natural geometry of the world. This man was taller, skin fairer, body a little bit more muscular, and most of all, he was a human, not a demi-human. But somehow, Eldia was sure that this was who she had been looking for this entire time. This was Jakku the Dragonborn. Yes, the power emanating from his core couldn't be disguised. It was bursting forth with overwhelming talent just waiting to be sharpened. She was hoping she could be the one to do so. She was to be the one who led the next generation of Swordmaster to grow. Excitement filling her, Eldia bent down and lightly tapped Jakku's shoulder, intending to wake him up from his rest. Blue lightning sparked out of Jakku's skin. Eldia's presence disappeared as she reappeared a few feet away from Jakku, a firm look now painted on her face. Then she frowned. Somehow she felt as if she had continued to prod him and wake him up, a sword would have sliced at her hands. Her eyes grew wide with shock. No way, that was not possible, that was sword intent. Had she mistaken him? Was this not the Dragonborn and instead a master swordsman? She walked up once again towards Jakku and stopped just a few feet away from him. Then she focused on him, she drew from deep inside her nascent core. And suddenly her sword intent pierced through the veil of reality, creating a sharp blow that threatened to hit Jakku's shoulder. As soon as that happened, blue lightning once again emanated off of the Dragonborn, and he suddenly awoke from his slumber. His eyes were entirely lightning, sparks buzzing all over his body. He looked to be a terrified cat, one that had its tail raised upwards in concern. Eldia smiled before sending another blow of sword intent towards him, shooting straight for his heart. Chapter 1264, Blue Lightning Awakens. Thunder rumbled off into the distance as Jakku unsheathed his sword and deflected a non-existent strike. Blue lightning clashed where Eldia's sword intent would have hit on Jakku's blade. "It is you," she muttered to herself, now that she saw that blue lightning. She was 100% sure that this was the same Dragonborn she'd been searching for this whole time. And it looked like her decision to disregard the Lionheart youngster was correct. Jakku was the superior talent through and through. After all, he could perceive her sword intent, and not only that, but he could even deflect it. A sword intent was something that only the most experienced swordmasters could conjure. It was the result of decades of their dedication to the sword. They would become so intertwined with their sword and their sword style that simply thinking about striking would create an actual strike in reality. It was very much similar to a nascent influence, except this one didn't need ability powers at all. In fact, it didn't even require the user to become a nascent spirit cultivator. One might think this to be a good thing, but in fact, this meant that having a sword intent was harder to achieve than being a nascent spirit cultivator. Talent wasn't enough. You'd need dedication. You'd need total and complete surrender to your art form. If you were able to be consistent with it for years and years, then maybe you could perceive a sword intent. And after more years of service to the sword, then maybe you could awaken your own sword intent as well. Yet as far as she knew, Jakku was simply a newborn in terms of swordplay. He was incredibly talented. She could see that despite his crude movements, he was able to somehow perceive the very nature of the sword itself. He just didn't have the guidance that most swordmasters had, but that didn't mean he wouldn't become a swordmaster himself. Perhaps he could become a swordmaster in 30 years instead of the usual 100. However, Eldia had a feeling that if she could teach this young talent, she could make him into a bona fide swordmaster in just 10. Then perhaps she could give him the title of the Heavenly Knight and she could finally retire. "Why didn't you answer my messages?" she asked Jaku. "My invitation still stands. I can make you into a true master of the sword." But Jaku didn't answer. Eldia frowned. It was at this moment that she realized that he wasn't actually awake. His eyes were pure lightning, but there was no shred of consciousness behind it, just pure lightning, pure unbridled power. And just as she thought that, Jaku moved, disappearing to a blue blur before he reappeared behind her, swinging his sword from above his head. Sword intent clashed against his attack, sending him back. But he charged forth all the same. A flurry of attacks and swings came her way, imbued with blue lightning. It was at this point that Eldia's arm moved. She flowed like water, making her arms look like they were waves formed from a disturbance in a still pool. And suddenly, water began to burst forth from out of nowhere, dousing the blue lightning and making it sputter out. This huge wall of water made Jaku's attacks ineffective. "It's about time you wake up," she said. And with another set of moves, this time much more powerful, like a tsunami. Calm at the start but showing its fangs near the end, and before you could even figure it out, a heaven's wall of water would crash towards you. Sword intent crashed through towards Jaku, making him retreat backwards. He floundered with his sword, using it to defend himself from the tsunami of sword intent that threatened to hit him in his critical points. Despite his novice movements, he was able to somehow navigate himself through to safety. It was through his intuition and pure talent that he was able to completely make himself safe against her attacks. Eldia's eyes observed Jaku's movements as she continued her barrage of attacks towards him. And as she did, she couldn't help but truly appreciate his talent. But then something happened, something sharp. She began to feel pinpricks in her eyes. Jaku's blue lightning started to spark. His eyes glowed ever more brightly. Then he began to move his arms, gently swaying it with the same movements that Eldia did just a couple of seconds ago. The heavenly swordmistress couldn't help but take a sharp breath. He copied her sword style. And suddenly, the water that was supposed to be calm, the one that was supposed to have been the epitome of serenity. The sword style now turned into a storm of lightning. It was as the lightning had created a wall of pure plasma that allowed Jaku to defend from the barrage of sword intents that Eldia attacked towards him. It was at this point that Eldia stopped her attacks, completely shocked at what she had just witnessed. Did he just use her technique against him? Did he just use her sword style and modified it to fit his own needs? That was impossible. She didn't even think most of her knights would be able to do that even if they trained for 100 years. And yet, Jaku was able to do it just from one look. He was able to grasp the very essence of her sword style in just a single glance. The hairs on her body began to rise. It was at this point that she realized how truly talented this young man was. She decided then and there, she was going to do everything in her power in order to make him her student. Once the barrage of sword intent stopped, Jaku's wall of lightning dissipated. But it looked like he wasn't going to end it there. He began to move, gently at first before starting to move with much more brutality. He was trying to copy her tsunami attack, and something in reality began to waver. A single point, a single slash made out of sword intent. Chapter 1265, Proposition for Reborn by Eldia. A wave of electrical energy, pure plasma surging out like a tsunami, not unlike that of Eldia's attack earlier. Except Jaku's attack was a lot wilder, more uncontrolled, like a true natural disaster. The lightning itself was not the focal point of the reason why this attack was so dangerous. It was mere decoration that only added flavor to the attack. The real meat of this came from the single point of sword intent in the middle of the attack. Hidden within those surging waves of blue lightning was a disturbance in reality that created a point in space that was much sharper than any physical blade in existence. It was something that could pierce through the very veil of reality itself. It was a true and genuine sword intent. Metal clanged as Eldia used her sword to deflect Jaku's attack, turning the blue lightning tsunami inert. The surging waves suddenly lost all of its power, as if a much more powerful natural act had somehow reversed all of its kinetic energy. The raging, unbridled energy dissipated. Alongside it was the single point of sharpness having been thoroughly destroyed by a much sharper and more realized sword intent by Eldia. A backlash of energy reverberated backwards towards Jaku, making the Dragonborn bounce back a few steps before he collapsed on the floor, unconscious. After that, everything turned peaceful. The serenity of this garden returned to normal, as if attacks as powerful as natural disasters hadn't just threatened to pierce through it and destroyed everything in its path. Eldia, for the first time in a long time, had to unsheath her sword when she didn't want to. She looked at the unconscious Dragonborn, who she had realized had been passed out this entire time. He hadn't been in control of himself when he had attacked her. That blue lightning in his eyes should have been a dead giveaway. It was as if his own nature had replaced his own consciousness in the moment in order to protect himself from a powerful opponent like the current heavenly swordmistress. She sighed as she sheathed her sword back to its scabbard. Such frightening talent, she muttered to herself. The fact that Jaku was able to replicate her sword styles to such a perfect degree meant that he had an innate understanding about swords and its essences. It was as if he was born with the approval of blades. Just through his own existence, he was able to grasp their meaning with a single glance. Perhaps that made him the most talented swordsman in the world. But that wasn't even the most surprising thing about him. It was the fact that, despite being such a crude recreation, Jaku was able to use a sword intent in that last attack. It was brief, one might even say that it was only a poor execution of the most skilled technique in swordplay. However, he was able to do it. She had heard about the legends. She'd heard that it was possible for those who hadn't achieved the nascent spirit to use the sword intent. But it was so hard that it was deemed impossible. It was harder than a mortal trying to change the very threads of reality like that of a nascent spirit cultivator with his nascent influence. Only in the ancient era was this possible. Ha ha ha, Eldia shook her head, she should have known. After all, Jaku was able to use the ancient roar. She should have known that he couldn't be compared with normal standards of this era. She knew he was talented, she just didn't know how much. Jaku had completely expended his energy during that fight with her. She could see that he wasn't just sleeping, he was fully passed out. It seemed that using that sword intent had fully drained him of his energy, which made sense. "You better rest," she whispered to him, "because in the next few days I will train you in order to become the most powerful swordsman in the world, perhaps in history." And so, she left Jaku alone to recover in the garden where she found him. She exited the premises of the guest house, finding herself back in the Rebornian estate gates. She didn't have to knock as she was able to sense the Rebornian attendant was already on her way to opening the door. "Oh, Miss Eldia, I was just about to call you. Our supreme leader is ready for you now." Eh, eh, eh. The heavenly swordmistress entered into Michael's office. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Michael asked. Eldia took a seat as Michael did behind his desk. "I am here about my message from a few weeks ago." Michael nodded, seemingly having already known what it was she wanted to talk about. "Jaku, you wanted to take him in as your student." "That is correct, I will not be taking no for an answer," she said with confidence. This made Michael's eyebrows raise. She didn't think she would be this insistent. What changed? Of course, if it was up to him, he would have already accepted Eldia's proposition. He always thought that Jaku still had a lot of left to be polished. His talent was overwhelming. Too overwhelming, in fact, that he usually didn't need training in order to become better than others, and this only fed into his own belief of being lazy. So it was good for him to have the heavenly swordmistress become his master. However, it wasn't really his decision. In the end, only Jaku can decide what he wanted for himself. And he already made it clear earlier that he didn't want any training whatsoever. He had to respect that. "This is for the good of your nation as well," Eldia added, realizing that she let her excitement get ahead of her. With me as his personal teacher, this will mean that your company will receive the benefits of having a heavenly knight in such close proximity. There are many resources in our hands: martial manuals, training regimens, cultivation pills, you name it. We can provide it for your company without any problem. That is the benefit of having me as Jaku's teacher. I accept. Chapter 1266, Double Offer. This time, it was Michael who got too ahead of himself. I want to accept. I really want to say yes. Eldia leaned forward. So you should. Jaku is your subordinate, he is your ally, and most importantly, he is your friend. By forcing him to become my student, he will only become a better version of himself. Don't let his laziness get in the way of that. Sometimes you have to push people in order for them to come out of their shell. Michael pursed his lips. Yes, and if that's all that mattered, then I would have already accepted it. This made Eldia a little bit frustrated. Then accept it, or are the benefits not enough? Let me tell you this, your company and your territory here in the parched lands have already gathered quite the reputation back in the upper echelon area, and perhaps this will cause other companies to take action against you. You will need to prepare, you will need to arm yourselves to the teeth, and from what I can see, your nation is not yet ready for it. You have powerful talents, but you do not have the army to defend yourself against others. In fact, it's one of the reasons why your company hasn't reached upper echelon status. Now this was surprising news to Michael. He always thought that it was because the upper echelons hadn't accepted him yet. But as it turned out, there was a hidden criteria that he needed to fulfill. Money, power, fame. Those are the three things that dictated the rankings for a company. Have one of those three and you could consider yourself as a successful company. Usually, those in the top 500 to top 300 companies in the golden ranking have excelled in one of those three qualities. Once you excel in two qualities, then you can possibly become ranked in the top 200 and below, perhaps even in the top 100. Right now, your company is in that area, but in truth, you are already more successful than even companies in the top 50. Your money and your fame far excels than even most of the upper echelon companies. Really, it's only your power aspect that's keeping your company in the lower 100 rankings. It's completely non-existent. You haven't proven yourself to be capable to defend against other upper echelon companies. Yes, you have the Dragonborns. You yourself are a nascent spirit cultivator. You have the officers and the top powers needed for an upper echelon organization. However, you still lack your army. It's the true measure of power. Once you have your army completely organized, then you will finally be recognized as an upper echelon. This revelation made Michael finally realize the reason for his stunted place in the golden rankings. It was his army that was lacking. With me as Jaku's teacher, I will be able to help you with that. I know that building an army is hard, and it's not something that can be done in a matter of a few months. But I do have something that I can help you with. If you are able to make your officers incredibly strong. So strong, in fact, that you do not have any need for an army, then perhaps you can become an upper echelon without having to prove your need for an army. This definitely was interesting enough for Michael to hear out. How? Your Dragonborns, I can see that they are all powerful in their own right, but just like Jaku, they are unpolished piece of gems. Once they are sharpened, I can see that they're all individually more powerful than anyone in the upper echelon society. And for them to become the fully realized version of their potential, they will need a teacher. I have connections, I have a personal relationship with the other heavenly knights. With a single call or letter from me, I can have them come here and teach your Dragonborns. Michael held his breath, his eyes widening. This was a chance that made his heart beat with excitement. Really? Eldia nodded. Usually those people are hermits. They don't leave their homes without any good reason. They don't even do it for our meetings. However, if I tell them that I found incredible talents in your company, which would not be a lie, then they would find themselves compelled to go here and teach themselves. She knew that just like her, the other heavenly knights were just raring to have a powerful student under their care. However, talent was rare. Luckily for the Reborn company, they weren't lacking in talent. In fact, they had an abundance for it. The Dragonborns were truly one of a kind. If I become Jakku's teacher, then you can be assured that the other Dragonborns will have heavenly knights as their teachers as well. Michael pursed his lips. It took him everything in his power not to immediately say yes. This was too tempting of an offer. I really want to say yes. Then do it. I can't. But why? Eldia was starting to get impatient. It's because you're not the only ones who asked me that question today. Eh? Michael and Eldia walked out of their meeting room, finding themselves in the open area training field outside. In the distant horizon they can see a gathering of people in the desert, people marching, people swinging swords. It took one look for Eldia to realize that Reborn was training an army. So you're already preparing an army, she realized. I didn't think you had the capacity. It was at this moment that Eldia's incredible senses finally kicked in. She put her focus on the few powerful swordsmen training the recruits. They felt familiar. They seemed like well-trained soldiers that she had seen before. Then she saw him. Overseeing recruits at the center of the camp was a familiar face, a familiar fire on his chest. The Lionhearts, they're training your recruits. Pure shock was written on her face, shock and awe. Chapter 1267, Instruct. Eldia was well familiar with the Lionhearts. They were a household name, especially in the Order of the Heavenly Knights. Their ancestors were legends written down in the history of their organization. Because of that, the Lionhearts received a lot of respect from the Order. They were the only ones who were able to train with the other knights, giving them invaluable experience that helped them sharpen their skills to a whole other level. It's not an exaggeration to say that perhaps the Lionhearts were almost at the same level as the swordsmen knights in the Order. And now, the Reborn Company was somehow training with the Lionhearts, learning their coveted Eternal Flame sword style nonetheless. Eldia couldn't believe this, but aren't they supposed to be on retainer for the Oscorp conglomerates? As far as she knew, they were supposed to serve only them and no other. And even though they were a conglomerate, the Lionhearts never taught them their Eternal Flame sword style. They may have used their swordsmen to protect the Oscorps, but they had never used their own resources to train them the way the Lionhearts had been trained. But from what Eldia saw right now, the Rebornians were being taught exactly the Eternal Flame sword style. Even the knights from the Order would die of jealousy if they were to hear about this. After all, this was the strongest sword style that could be found in the world. And now, the Rebornians were learning it. She could see wisps of flames erupt from their swords. They were struggling, but slowly but surely their forms were getting better and better. Things happened, Michael explained not so greatly. They eventually found out that we were able to increase magnetic cultivation without having to risk their lives. They wanted to partake in that, and in return they would teach us how to become better. What? Michael nodded. Yeah, that was definitely a steal, right? I've heard that the Eternal Flame sword style is a secret not even you as the Heavenly Swordmistress is allowed to learn. No, I meant the thing about the increase in magnetic cultivation. Oh. Eldia's attention was then led towards the western horizon, where the imposing figure of the Cthulhu stood amongst the endless desert. With a bit of explanation from Michael, she eventually got the gist as to how that worked. Of course, as a heavenly knight and a leader for the Way of the Sword, she also wanted her own men and women to experience this so-called roller coaster. If her knights were to become stronger in cultivation without having to risk their lives in actual combat, then who knows what kind of things the Way of the Sword could achieve. She must see it for herself. Her swordsmen must take advantage of it as well. It was at this point that Eldia became completely consumed in her own dilemma. She wanted to see the Cthulhu roller coaster for herself. At the same time, she wanted to go to Jakku and ensure that he would become her student. She grunted, where is Jakku? I really need him to accept my proposition. Michael was about to say something else when he saw that Jakku had appeared somewhere in the horizon, going with the other recruits training in the army. Oh, speaking of the lazy devil, why don't we go speak to him now? Three individuals walked up to a singular tree in the parched lands. This tree was large, its canopy as wide as a small village. Because of that, the shade it brought was very desirable for those who wanted to sleep. And one such individual was Jaku. He laid on top of one of the large, overground roots of this giant tree. "This is going to be interesting," Michael muttered to himself as the two people beside him walked forward. "Jaku, I shall become your master," Eldia proclaimed. "You shall become my student, Jaku," Caliburn said. As soon as both of their proclamations came out of their mouths, they both looked at each other. And in that instant, they both had a silent understanding with each other. They knew of each other's capabilities and knew that each would benefit from having Jaku as their student. It was an esteem that would be too good to pass up. Their eyes clashed. Sword intent flashed between them, creating literal sparks as both of these master swordsmen competed to see who amongst them would become this once-in-a-lifetime talent's master. "Heavenly Swordmistress, surely you are way too busy with the matters of the order to truly teach this young swordsman," Caliburn jabbed. Eldia shook her head. "Speak for yourself, Lionheart Patriarch. Didn't you promise to protect the Oscorp conglomerates? I'm sure they're looking for you now." Both never backed down. They stepped forward, their shoulders jostling against each other. "Jaku is my student." "No, he's mine." It was at this point that the man in question began to thrash around in his sleep. "Arggh, so noisy, I'm not going to be anyone's student. I don't want to learn any of your teachings." And with that declaration, Jaku went back to sleep, using some of the moss around him to muffle his ears. "You are seriously wasting your own talent," said Eldia. "Trust me, you will thank us in the future." "Are you not an officer of Reborn? Are you truly willing to let your company be devoid of any master swordsman? Are you willing to let your laziness get in the way of your company's greatness?" Caliburn said. It was at this point that Jaku slowly opened his eyes, a pained expression written in those blue eyes. He seemed to be on the verge of agreeing with them. "That's right, with our Lionheart's eternal flame, you can become a swordsman who can cut the world in half." "That is a waste of your talents," Eldia rebutted. "Learn from my experience and focus on your natural talent for speed." "You're an inadequate teacher." "No, you are, you brute." Seeing them bickering, Jaku knew he would be too lazy to hear them out. He quickly went back to sleep. Michael sighed and stepped up. "Why not both?" Chapter 1268, Both. The Lionheart Patriarch and the Heavenly Swordmistress both looked at Michael. "Why not both?" he repeated. "Why don't you both teach Jaku?" His question made them pause. Of course, as swordsmen, they knew the answer to that question easily. It's not possible. After all, mastering a sword style required a lifetime of passion, devotion, and dedication. If one were to learn two sword styles at the same time, they would need 2 lifetimes in order to become proficient in both to become a master swordsman. So it was always better to simply focus on one sword style. That way, they could reach the master swordsman title much more easily. In history, no one had ever mastered 2 sword styles and became proficient enough in it to become renowned. Especially the Eternal Flame sword style along with Eldia's own sword style, both of which were considered to be at the pinnacle of difficulty and prowess. But then Michael's words made them think. If Jaku was a normal person, then the option of learning both sword styles was definitely out of the window. But then again, if he was a normal person, they wouldn't even have fought for him to become their student. No, Jaku was perhaps a once-in-a-lifetime talent, one that would definitely become better than both of them given enough time and training. He may very well define the meaning of swordsmanship for the future generation. Attaining the Heavenly Swordsman title was definitely in his pathway by pure virtue of his talent. They both looked at each other, and then and there was another silent understanding between each other. Was it possible could they both teach Jaku? It seemed insane. After all, both of their sword styles were the complete antithesis of each other. The Eternal Flame was created in order to become the most powerful sword style ever created. It could tear everything asunder with flames that could never be extinguished. Meanwhile, Eldia used a sword style that was the embodiment of all of her experiences as a heavenly swordmistress. It focused on perception, on the senses, in order to defend against any attack no matter what kind it was. The Eternal Flame focused on offense, Eldia's sword style focused on defense. But perhaps that's what made it perfect for each other. What if both of those sword styles were combined into one? Could it create the pinnacle of the sword? Could it be a sword style without any drawbacks, without any weaknesses? It was a great thought, but it was merely a theoretical thought. Combining two sword styles was not an easy task. Some might say it was impossible. Eldia and Caliburn definitely could not do it. They were way too experienced in their own sword styles that if they tried to incorporate the other's sword style, then their own biases would only favor their own over the other. If both sword styles were to be combined, then Jaku was the only one who could do it. He was the perfect specimen. He hadn't learned anything yet despite his powerful swordsmanship. He was a clay ready to be molded. And his natural talent allowed him to easily perceive the essence of a sword style with just one look. If there was ever anyone who could combine two sword styles together, it would be him. This thought permeated on both master swordsmen. The idea struck them like a fever. They became thoroughly flustered and excited at the thought. If this worked, if they were able to do as Michael suggested, then they would be able to do something that not even their ancestors were capable of. They would be the one to usher the ultimate swordsman into the world. Heavenly Mistress, Caliburn said, lightly bowing his head. Sir Caliburn, Eldia said, doing a little curtsy. It was at this point that they both decided on a truce. They decided that they were going to teach Jaku with their own sword styles and let the Dragonborn figure out how to combine it all on his own. Michael, you have a deal. We shall become Jaku's master, said Caliburn. Trust that he will become unparalleled with the sword, said Eldia. Michael was overjoyed, of course. Jaku, on the other hand, was a little bit frustrated. But I haven't even accepted yet. Shush, student, this matter has gone way over your head. It is a matter about the future of the sword. Your decision is ultimately not needed. Now you should prepare yourself, student. You'll have twice the learning you'll need to do. The Dragonborn could feel his laziness getting threatened. His greatest sleeping spot would hereby become pestered by two old bees buzzing at his ears. And with their powerful senses, he had no doubt that they'd be able to catch him whenever he went. Was there no other choice? Was the only way for him to find peace was to go to the moon? Trust me, said Eldia. Your own talent demands this kind of instruction. You do not know it, but you have already shown your own desire in learning. If you hadn't, then you wouldn't have used my own sword style against me. You wouldn't have been able to use sword intent against me. It was at this point that Caliburn's eyes widened even more as he looked at Eldia. What? Eldia seemed surprised. What, you didn't know? No, what do you mean that he can use sword intent? The heavenly swordmistress then told Caliburn about her experience with Jaku earlier. I see, his subconscious is that powerful, huh? This is going to be exciting. Jaku tried to run away, disappearing off into the horizon with his blue lightning. However, both swordmasters caught up to him without even a single problem. It was then that they started their instruction on the Dragonborn, teaching him both of their sword styles. This left Michael all alone to ponder. Sword intent, huh? Was that what they used to fight against each other? Michael closed his eyes, and suddenly a single point of sharpness cut through to the ground beneath his feet. A hole 30 feet underground was created. Chapter 1269, Sword Style. Michael looked at the hole in the ground and was satisfied with himself. Thanks to ChatJK6, he could easily replicate what he had seen from the two grand swordmasters. Of course, the fact that he was already a nascent spirit cultivator helped. This sword intent was different from that of a nascent influence. However, they both kind of worked by the same principles. As long as his intent behind a sword attack became so solid like that of a nascent influence, then he could create sword intent. Michael was not a swordsman. Even with this power, he was sure that he would not last even a few seconds against a true swordsman. However, it was a good tool to have. He did occasionally use a sword. The Unity Saber was very useful in a lot of ways. Should I also learn how to use a sword? Positive, ChatJK6 replied. She wanted him to continue watching the Grand Masters teach the new recruits, and using her incredible processing power, she could easily apply those teachings for Michael. And so that's what Michael did. While the new recruits absorbed the techniques from the Lionhearts, Michael watched from afar. He didn't use his drones nor his clones. He used his own eyes and his own perception to actually watch the proceedings. He believed that he wouldn't be able to fully appreciate the lessons if he were to just condense everything from ChatJK6. He would even take out his Unity saber and wave it around, mimicking the sword styles he'd seen. They. Throughout the days, the new recruits began to shape up into something impressive. With the help of the Lionhearts and now the heavenly swordmistress and her entourage of knights, the Rebornians were given the best type of teachings anyone could receive. The knights proved as a veritable practice resource. They were able to spar with the new recruits, giving them the precious experience that they needed in order to let the Eternal Flame sword style flourish the way it should have. As for Jakku, the Dragonborn had no choice but to follow the whims of his two masters. Caliburn and Eldia didn't let Jakku's own laziness get in the way of his training. Every time he tried to shy away from his responsibility, they would fetch him using their own men or one of Michael's attendants, and if that didn't work, they searched for him themselves. Michael helped Jakku and fed him to the wolves. After all, he also wanted to see how the two grand swordmasters would teach him. Now, the Eternal Flame sword style may be the strongest offensive power there was. However, Eldia's own sword style was powerful on its own as well, providing great defense. And their teachings reflected that. Caliburn had Jakku performing different sorts of sword swings, each one being more awkward than the last. This is to ensure that your sword will not lack power no matter what kind of position you end up in. A fight will always be unpredictable. It's best to prepare for it right now. While he was being taught that, Eldia herself dedicated time to give Jakku the best defensive positions possible. My sword style is called the Serene Gentile Dragon. It is something that I have created myself and will not necessarily be useful to you, Eldia said. But that doesn't mean that it won't be useful to you. I shall teach you the method on how I was able to create this technique so that you can use your learnings from both of us and condense it into your own sword swings. Caliburn and Eldia's sword philosophies were completely opposite from one another. However, that didn't stop them from creating a sort of synergy whenever they taught Jakku. They were grand swordmasters. Their understanding of the sword was such that they were able to understand each other on a fundamental level. If Caliburn taught Jakku to swing his sword 1 degree to the right, Eldia immediately knew the reason why and supplemented that. It was the same vice versa. Michael watched all of this from the sidelines and absorbed these teachings. Although none of them were directed towards his own, he found them useful regardless. I see, I've just been swinging my sword around without actually knowing the reason why, he said to himself. He never really knew how to wield a sword, but he had to. It was only through necessity that he had his Unity saber. It was only now that he was starting to understand the meaning of the sword. Replication of the Lionheart Patriarch, 39%. Replication of the Heavenly Swordmistress, 25%. ChatJK6, of course, took this chance to further her own knowledge about swordsmanship. This would benefit Michael greatly, but that didn't mean that he would stop learning and simply let ChatJK6 upload the knowledge into his mind. He believed he wouldn't be able to actually learn the sword that way. And so, a week passed in training before a message arrived in the nation of Reborn. The elite Penumbra Shadow Orc returned to Michael's side, reporting to him. "Ra-ta-ta, I come bearing news, boss." This was the orc they sent to talk to Lionhearts left back in the Oscorp estate. Both Caliburn and Michael were excited to learn that their operation had succeeded. 3 battalions of the Lionhearts are currently on the way to the Parched Lands, the elite Penumbra said. With the help of our shadows, they will pass through our lands unnoticed. How has Oscorp responded to our movements? Caliburn asked nervously. As you have ordered, we first messaged Trilla Oscorp and asked for her help. She was a bit hesitant once she learned of who we were. However, we presented her the Lionheart emblem just like you said, and only through that did she believe us. She helped us take out the 3 battalions of Lionheart out of the Oscorp estate under the guise of Trilla's own purpose. This excited Caliburn. Finally, their army would arrive in Reborn. Finally, they could be fed and nourished under this tremendously powerful growth that they'd been under. The lion hearts that had been in Reborn for the last week or so had been growing tremendously. Most of them had reached one stage higher in their cultivation already, with no signs of stopping. It even looked like they were going to advance soon as well. Caliburn was excited to see their reactions once they saw their fellow men. "And Trilla?" The shadow orc nodded. "She is with the army, sir." This was good news for them all. With Trilla there, this meant that the cooperation with Reborn and her faction would go smoothly. Once she sees this place, she'll understand Caliburn's decision, and through that, their cooperation could finally start back in the chasm. Of course, they would still need to shape up their army for them to do so. Thankfully, the Rebornians were nothing if not talented. They picked up the Lionheart's teachings quite easily. The elite Penumbra orc also reported to them about the developments outside. The bridge of the chasm was still a highly contested thing as of this moment. Many companies were trying to build one for themselves. The upper echelons and the conglomerates weren't yet moving to position themselves to build it, but they were looking around, assessing things. According to his reports, the Oscorps weren't the only conglomerate sending one of their branches to the chasm for positioning. This gave Michael a time limit. They needed to build that bridge ASAP before any of the conglomerates could get their hands on it. The upper echelons, he didn't have to worry. Each of their attempts had been rebuffed by the demi-humans. What he had to worry about was the conglomerates. Once they set up their armies and their resources near the chasm, with their power, they could easily wipe out the demi-humans with brute force. And if they wanted to, they could have sent an elite task force to do it as soon as possible. The only reason why they haven't done so was because this would lead the other conglomerates to counterattack them at full force. Once the demi-humans were gone, this would leave the conglomerate task force that attacked them vulnerable. By then, it would be very easy for other people, even the upper echelons, to swoop in and take the bridge for themselves. That was why they were taking their time, gathering their forces near the chasm. Michael, on the other hand, wasn't planning on destroying the demi-humans. In fact, he was planning the opposite. He wanted to cooperate with them. He just needed a way. A few days after, the Lionheart battalions had finally arrived in Reborn. Numbering in the tens of thousands, these group of people were a highly trained collection of soldiers with elite skills that made them desirable even to the upper echelons and the conglomerates. Among them was Trilla Oscorp. She stopped and looked at the looming city that was the nation of Reborn. "I will save you, uncle," Trilla said, determination flashing across her face. Chapter 1270, Sword Styles. The Rebornian army started to take shape. With the help of the Lionhearts, they were able to create the first division of their nation. Numbering a total of 16,000 soldiers, these groups of people all had talent in the sword. So, it wasn't that surprising to see when all of them were able to pick up the Eternal Flame sword style with a little bit of time. This division had 4 brigades, each having 4,000 men inside. And in each brigade there were companies numbering 100 or so men. Beyond that was the platoon, having 50 men in total, and each platoon had a squad of 10 soldiers in total. Of course, each part of this army was led by their own respective leaders. The Lionhearts chose it from the group of people who had shown tremendous talent and charisma during their boot camp. Those who had not only performed great but also pushed their fellow men to become better were easily chosen to become chiefs, sergeants, and commandants. At the very top of the swordsman division of their army, there was none other than Jakku. Of course, the Dragonborn had no intention of ever wanting to become a general, however, he had no choice. Caliburn and the Lionhearts were not truly a part of the Rebornian nation as of yet, so it would be inappropriate for them to take office into their most important positions. And also, Jakku was considered to be the strongest swordsman in the nation itself. Added into the fact that he was very popular within the swordsman division, he was easily chosen to become their leader. "Most of your soldiers have learned the first to third form of the Eternal Flame sword style," Caliburn said. "That's enough for them to use it in battle. Now whether they use it effectively is still a question yet to be answered." Caliburn had seen these swordsmen in the boot camp. Thanks to their immense talent, they were able to understand the essence of the sword style easily. They performed the necessary swings and steps to conjure up the signature red fire of the eternal flame. However, doing it in practice and doing it on a real battlefield were two completely different experiences. They still didn't know if these Rebornians could keep their composure during a fight. "Well, we can always test that," Michael said. Caliburn's eyebrows raised. Michael then suggested for the swordsman division to each have a turn in the Cthulhu roller coaster. And while in that ride, they would try their best to perform the eternal flame sword forms to the best of their ability. This made the Lionheart Patriarch speechless for a little bit. Why didn't he think of that? It seemed like the perfect solution. And so, the Cthulhu roller coaster was reserved for the rest of the day to give the swordsman division the time they needed to practice. Of course, the Lionhearts didn't let this opportunity pass. They too joined in on the weird training regimen, hoping that it would help them increase their skill level with their sword style. Meanwhile, an army marching from the horizon loomed closer and closer to the nation of Reborn. With Trilla leading the Lionheart battalions forward, they scouted forwards, searching for any signs of their comrades. "We must not let them know we are here," Trilla said. "Uncle Caliburn may have been under duress when he wrote that letter. He may be kidnapped." So he had one of their scouts go on forward, using his diva to let them see the nation up close and personal using some kind of magnification. And using this ability power, they were able to see and hear the hustle and bustle of the so-called paradise in the desert. Screams, they all turned their heads towards one direction, away from the nation itself, towards the giant monster looming on the horizon, a leviathan-like beast that should have been left under the ocean. There they heard the screams. Trilla's eyes widened. Using the diva's telescope, she was able to see wisps of flame emanating out of the Cthulhu. These flames were fiery, colored with the hue of a campfire, a red sun, and the vitality of the phoenix. There was no mistaking it. That was the eternal flame of the Lionhearts. Her uncle Caliburn was probably fighting the monster in order to escape. It must have been their warden. "March on forwards to the Leviathan monster. We shall save Uncle," Trilla said. Meanwhile, Jakku kept to himself as he laid on the ground, sweat dripping off of his human skin. He didn't like sweating. Ever since he became a human, he suddenly gained the ability to sweat. His scales never did that. Now he wished to return back to his old form. Sure, he was much stronger than he was before. He was faster, more agile, more powerful. But what did that get him? He was now forced to swing the sword almost 24/7 by a duo of old swordmaster with some kind of fanaticism for his own sword. They didn't let him off. His boss, Michael, had betrayed him. He had allowed those two old geezers to have full control over him. They could force him to do whatever they wanted. And they didn't let that opportunity pass. They had him perform 100,000 of the same sword swings until his arms hurt. If that wasn't enough, they continued to make his life harder. They would put on restraints in his arms, metal braces that seemed to weigh 1,000 tons. They would even blindfold him, hoping that he would see the way the heavenly swordmistress did. The eternal flame sword style focuses on offense. You must cleave through every problem. Your fire must turn everything asunder, Jakku said, parodying Caliburn's words. "The essence of my sword style is gentleness. Only through careful thought and observation could you ensure that any of your opponent's attacks can be defended against," he said again, this time parodying Eldia's words. Both of his teachers were working together. However, their teachings couldn't be any more different. No wonder he was having a little bit of trouble understanding them. One wanted him to keep swinging, the other wanted him to stop swinging and only observe. How was he to do both? Now individually he could easily perform their supposed sword styles. Flames of red appeared in his blade as he swung it in an arc above his head. Eternal flame, fourth form. Then, with a thought that flame was extinguished, his movement changed from fast and erratic to a gentle swaying motion. Water erupted from his sword, sending mist and a rainbow flying in front of him. An almost imperceivable water bubble surrounded him. Anything that crosses this water bubble he could sense, meaning he could react to any attacks coming his way. The heavenly swordmistress thought that he wouldn't be able to perform this for at least another month. He did it in a few days. Jakku closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He began to change his movements once again. His movements began fast, but gentle. He tried to simply force the two sword styles to converge against each other. Flames began to blaze on the tip of his blade. The red hue of the fire began to color the water bubble from a serene blue into a fiery red. And for a second, a different kind of aura emanated out of Jakku, a tyrannical power yet with a hint of gentleness, power and defense all in one. But the water in the bubble began to seethe. The fire had completely evaporated the water bubble. Jakku fell on the floor, panting. Every time he tried to connect the two sword styles, one would always overpower the other. Either the flames won out or the water would evaporate it. Eldia told him he could do it, though he was starting to doubt her words. They. Meanwhile, Trilla and the Lionheart battalions finally finished their march towards the Leviathan monster. With their swords raised and ready to join the fight, they were quickly thrown into confusion when they heard laughter echo out of the Cthulhu. They stopped in their tracks. What was happening? They saw humans and demi-humans alike rush past, their swords burning with an orange flame as they swung it around. Eternal flame, who taught them how to do that? Lady Trilla, one of her commandants, called out to her, pointing towards one of the riders on the roller coaster. That's my cousin. He wasn't the only Lionheart having the time of their lives here. Oh, you finally arrived. Welcome, welcome. They all turned to see Caliburn looking at them with that big smile of his. Trilla and the rest of the Lionhearts were at a loss for words. They rushed here thinking Caliburn had been kidnapped. They fought through hell and back just to escape Oscorp's clutches. Throughout their journey they experienced skirmishes, assassinations, and other sinister plots. Yet these guys were just having fun and playing around. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. This is Jason audiobook, and I just want to give a huge thank you to every single one of you for staying all the way through. Whether you're listening to relax, to escape, or to dive deeper into these incredible worlds, your time and support truly mean everything. Every like, every comment, and every share helps this channel grow and allows more stories to come to life in audiobook form. You're not just listeners, you're part of this journey. If you have a web novel you'd love to hear turned into an audiobook, don't hesitate to send me a DM. I'm always looking for new adventures to bring to the channel, and your suggestions could be the next big story we dive into. And if you're enjoying the content and want to support even more, consider checking out the Patreon for exclusive early releases, bonus chapters, and behind-the-scenes content. Once again, thank you for being here. Until the next chapter, stay immersed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next story.